For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass House Bill 3151, the Taxpayer First Act.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3151, a bill to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to modernize and improve the Internal Revenue Service and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Lewis, and the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Brady, each will control 20 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include explanatory material on the measure.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized. Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of House Bill 3151, the Taxpayer First Act. Mr. Speaker, this is not a Republican or a Democratic bill. It is an American one. Let me begin by thanking Chairman Neal, Ranking Member Brady, the Oversight Subcommittee Ranking Member Kelly, and all members who join us on this bill. I would also like to recognize Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Wyden, and their staff, who were our Senate partners on this necessary effort. In particular, I would like to thank our staff for their hard and great and good work. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of the process and the product. The record must be clear. Members of the House and the Senate spent many years reaching ideas to help taxpayers. The Oversight Subcommittee held 14 hearings and roundtables. We reach out to taxpayers and stakeholders. We ask questions and listen to the responses. We ask Democratic and Republican members to provide feedback. We even opened a public comment period on the draft bill. We came together, we studied, we listened, and we respected the taxpayer. Mr. Speaker, this has not been easy. We worked hard to correct misinformation that this bill would tie the hands of the IRS and hurt taxpayers' option. During a time when there's so much tension and rush to judgment, our coalition remained thoughtful and fair. After the House passed this legislation earlier this year, new information came out, and I'm proud that we came together and requested an investigation, and the IRS responded quickly and took action. Mr. Speaker, despite every single challenge, we remain committed to bipartisanship and to the American taxpayers. I want to share a few examples of good this bill does. The Taxpayer First Act authorizes $30 million in matching grants for the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program, which helps low and moderate income taxpayers complete and file their taxes. This bill also protects certain low-income taxpayers from the private debt collection program. In addition, some of the most popular parts of the bill include new initiatives to protect and serve taxpayers who are victims of identity theft. Mr. Speaker, the Taxpayer First Act serves as an example of the good and the thoughtful policy that Congress can produce. We took our time, we studied, and we stayed the course. We refused to give up, and we refused to give in. Mr. Speaker, this bill should be an inspiration to us all. I urge all of my colleagues to support the Taxpayer First Act, and I reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Texas is recognized. Mr. Brady.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this bill represents what this body can accomplish when we work together across the aisle. It's true that no one gets everything they want, but we put in the effort, we did the hard work, we talked to each other, and we came together to find solutions and common ground. I'm honored to have co-sponsored the Taxpayer First Act with my friend from Georgia, Oversight Subcommittee Chairman John Lewis. This is the 5th time this bill will pass the House with strong bipartisan support. And I'm proud of the House leadership, Democrats and Republicans together, initiated first by Mr. Lewis and Mr. Roscom of Illinois, then Mr. Lewis and Ms. Jenkins of Kansas, and now Mr. Lewis and Mr. Kelly. This will be the 5th time this passes the House, which tells you the importance of this legislation. And I want to especially thank you, Chairman Lewis, for your commitment to taxpayers and for working with us on behalf of the American people. The IRS should be a customer service agency that focuses on treating taxpayers with respect and dignity. Over the last several years, the Ways and Means Committee held a number of bipartisan hearings to discover what's working and what isn't at the IRS. As we crafted this legislation together to redesign the IRS for the first time in 2 decades, we focused on improving the relationship between the taxpayer and the agency. We all agree the IRS should prioritize taxpayers' rights and that it should be a resource, not a threat to Americans. This bill achieves these goals. After passage of the Taxpayer First Act, Americans will interact with an IRS that carries out customer service more like our businesses, because this bill will improve the support Americans receive online, in person, and on the phone. This bill takes a number of steps to move the IRS into the 21st century. First, the IRS will have to come up with a customer service plan to better serve taxpayers, because no American should fear contacting the IRS for help. We also together rein in the abuses. We are overhauling the IRS's enforcement tools so families and small businesses don't have property unfairly seized. The Constitution guarantees Americans the right to due process and protection from unreasonable searches and seizures. In hearings led by Chairman Lewis and others, we've heard stories from across the country of the IRS abusing these rights. Under this bill, that stops. Third, the Taxpayer First Act recasts the IRS as their tax administrator rather than simply an enforcement agency. We will better protect taxpayers from enforcement abuses by creating an independent appeals office. This will give taxpayers a fair and impartial review of disputes they have with the IRS. The bill also ensures taxpayers have the same access to information as the IRS, putting our taxpayers on a level playing field. We're revamping the IRS's ancient technology and better positioning the agency to combat identity theft and cyber threats. IRS employees, as hard as they work, are currently using technology that is severely outdated. Some of it dates back to the 1960s. This bill requires accountability by the IRS for the billions of dollars in funding it's given for IT each year. And this accountability extends to ensuring taxpayer information is protected and it's safe from cyber criminals looking to steal your taxpayer refunds. This bill also strengthens the IRS's partnership with states and the private sector to combat these threats. And finally, this bill requires the IRS to bring back to Congress a complete restructuring of the agency focused on these principles of taxpayer-first customer service, reining in those abuses, protecting our private taxpayer information, making sure there is a fair appeals process in those disputes with the IRS. Taken together, these reforms will greatly benefit Americans each year during tax season and throughout the year. I urge support of H.R. 3151, and with that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to include in the record an exchange of letters regarding H.R. 3151 between the House Committee on Financial Service and the House Committee on Ways and Means, and exchange a letter between the House Committee on Appropriation and the House Committee on Ways and Means. Now, Mr. Speaker,
Without objection.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentle lady from California, Congresswoman Hill.
Gentlewoman from California, Ms. Hill, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you so much, Congressman Lewis. I rise in support of H.R. 3151, the Taxpayer First Act, which is a very exciting piece of legislation because who doesn't get excited about taxes? However, in all seriousness, we should get excited when paying taxes or filing our taxes becomes easier and better for the American people. I'm so thrilled to be here today to offer my support, and I'm beyond grateful that my concerns with the free file provision were heard and acted upon. I'm beyond grateful to Congressman Lewis's leadership on this legislation, which will save the government money, protect low-income individuals, and give the IRS resources to offer many additional much-needed services. I also want to thank the Congressman's staff and the Ways and Means Committee staff for working with my team, who also deserves a great deal of thanks, to make this happen. It's an incredible example of the collaboration that can happen to positively affect people's lives, and I cannot begin to express my gratitude to such a long-term, well-respected leaders such as John Lewis for taking my concerns into consideration and involving me in the process, even though I'm a lowly freshman. The fact that we were able to get this provision resolved is showing how Congress is changing and showing how we are bringing power away from corporations and special interests and back into the hands of regular people, and I'm proud to be part of that effort. So I urge all of my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back. Thank you so much.
Gentlewoman from California yields back the balance of her time. Gentleman from Georgia reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve and am prepared to close.
Gentleman from Texas reserves the balance of his time.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers. I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
So in closing, this bipartisan bill puts an emphasis on the IRS better serving Americans and make sure that it is customer focused. It reins in the abuses, requires the IRS to better protect our privacy, creates an independent appeals process, makes sure that taxpayers are put on the same level playing field as the agency, and requires them to bring back a complete restructuring plan to Congress. I'm so appreciative of the work of our Democrat colleagues and Chairman Lewis, especially coming together again today to support these reforms, the IRS, and show our constituents that we put their interests ahead of Washington. Again, I strongly urge support of H.R. 3151, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Brady, yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Taxpayer First Act is a bipartisan bill in both the House and in the Senate. This bill will improve the Internal Revenue Service and help taxpayers. This is a good and necessary bill. Again, I would like to thank the ranking member, Mr. Brady, and thank Member Kelly in his absence, Chairman Neal, and our staff for all of their hard and good work on this important bill. I urge all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support the Taxpayer First Act. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Georgia yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 3151? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion reconsidered is laid on the table.